Welcome back to the podcast, Unbinding the Bible. This is episode 189, From Eden to the Ends of the Earth. And on the podcast this week, we are going to continue our look at the nation of Israel and biblical Israel and potentially the relationship between the two. And I know I have taken a couple weeks off. That was due to a vacation as well as Holy Week, which for me as a pastor is a very busy time of the year. And so we are going to pick right back up on the mini-series that we began several weeks ago for those of you who are listening to this in real time. But I am very, very excited about this episode. I don't know exactly how it is going to unfold. I typically record these introductions before I even record the episode. And so I'm just talking to you here in my office on a Wednesday afternoon. I plan to publish this tomorrow morning, but I have a lot of notes. I have a lot of quotes from some resources that I have been diving into, but some of this might just be me talking really fast as I try to get these ideas out. But what I am about to share, I think, has the potential to be one of the best episodes on the podcast. And the reason why I think that, as the creator of Unbinding the Bible, is because what I'm going to present to you today, while I find it to be relatively simple to understand, is actually a fundamental groundwork for the way I approach the Bible as a whole. And I'm going to do my best to show you how that works. We've talked about these topics, we've kind of danced around them at different times, but today I'm going to attempt to take those concepts and show you how I think biblically and faithfully we can think about the biblical story and how it as a whole relates to the land of Israel-Palestine. And I do think that this will be helpful for you. Again, you may connect better with another episode, but as I began to piece this together and thought about the best way to put it into one episode, it just got me really excited. And of course, as you know, I get excited about a lot of things. So hey, maybe this won't be the best episode, but that's fine. There are several hundred others that you can pick from to be your favorite. So I am glad that you are tuning in this week. Without any more of an introduction, let's just jump right into it. From Eden to the Ends of the Earth. Before we dive into the content for this week's episode, I do want to make an exciting announcement, and that is to let you know and for you to then let your friends know or your family or anybody else who you care to share this with that Unbinding the Bible is now on YouTube. And I had a friend encourage me to tap into that resource to attempt to expand the listening audience. I know some people just prefer going onto YouTube and searching for things. They do that more regularly than necessarily on a particular podcast app. And maybe that's you, and you have graciously followed me through a podcast app, maybe against your preferences, or I'm not sure how it fits for you, but it is on YouTube now. And I was able to find my RSS feed and connect that to YouTube and download all 225 episodes. If all goes according to plan, when I publish this episode tomorrow, it'll become live instantly on YouTube along with Apple iTunes and Spotify and everywhere else that you happen to listen to podcasts. So if you would like to find podcasts, just Unbinding the Bible on YouTube, it should pop up. I believe I've made them all public. You'll see just a logo of the podcast, and then you'll hear the audio. I don't have videos. I still record these podcasts on my cell phone. I don't really like a lot of fancy equipment and don't feel that it's overly necessary for what I'm trying to accomplish. So did want to pass that on to you. I was excited about that. Very thankful to have another platform to try to get the word out. And a few episodes are making some traction, but I haven't really publicized it yet. Thought I would start with you all who are my faithful 150 listeners who tune in each week and make that available to you. So just to let you know, Unbinding the Bible is now on YouTube, and I'm pretty excited about that. So if you have tuned into the podcast sometime during the course of the last 5 years, you may have started at the beginning of the podcast. You may not. I do know of several people that started listening to the podcast somewhere in the middle of Revelation. and did go back and listen to the beginning of the Revelation series and have worked their way up and have maintained, a current listening status. I've had some who will find an intriguing episode. They'll just listen to the book interview episodes that I do, which is great. Some have jumped in episode 150 and they've gone back a little, but have never gone all the way back. The reason why I'm bringing this to your attention is because what I want to do today is actually start at the beginning of the Bible again. And just to throw this out for those of you who have come along in the podcast and have not listened to the first several episodes, I did about 16, 17, 18, somewhere in there, episodes in the first few chapters of the book of Genesis. And wanting to lay a foundation for the biblical storyline, the way the Bible tells the story, and picking up all of the major themes that the Bible lays out for us, and then talk about how the rest of the Bible plays off of those themes. And we've done that with themes like the temple and priests in the temple and kingdom and light and, man and woman and being made in the image of God and how that relates to idolatry later on in the biblical story and so on and so forth. But what I want to do today is I want to take many of those same concepts that we used, but I want to apply it to the land itself, because somehow when we get into discussions about the land of Israel, it's almost as if that land gets treated as something entirely different from the rest of the Bible. Or, for instance, people who hold to views of the land will do something like they will see the promises in the Old Testament made about the land of Israel, or promises made about the restoration of the temple in Jerusalem, and they will miss significant things that unfold in the New Testament, like John chapter 2, when Jesus himself claimed to be the temple. And then how Paul picks up on that in 1 Corinthians, in 2 Corinthians, in Ephesians, how Peter picks up on that in 1 Peter, and refers to the people of God indwelt by his Holy Spirit as the temple of the living God. What I mean by they miss this is that they imagine somehow that Paul or Jesus or James or Peter or whoever is just using temple language as an example or as a metaphor, but that the promises made in the Old Testament of a rebuilt temple in the land of Israel, those things are still literal. And much of my podcast has been created to challenge that. In fact, I would like Jesus to be the one who gets to determine for us how we interpret Old Testament promises or Old Testament prophecies, because Jesus himself claims that the entire Bible is about him. It's not about the land. It's not about Israel. It's not about a temple. It's not about a kingdom. It's about him. And as he is the king of a kingdom, then it is about a kingdom. Or as he is the temple, then it is about a temple. And as he is the land, then it is about the land. And we'll get into what I mean by he is the land in a subsequent episode. It will not be this one, but I will set us up for those episodes in this one today. So I just wanted to give that disclaimer. If you haven't gone back and listened to some of those episodes, I would encourage you to do it. It will set the framework for how you understand the entire Bible. If you have listened to those episodes, then you will hear me repeat a few things about the way that I think the Bible tells its own story. And so let me just jump straight to the point of what I am about to share for the next 45 minutes or so. And that is this. The Garden of Eden is to the land of Israel what the land of Israel is to the world. So let me repeat myself. The Garden of Eden is to the land what the land is to the world. Now, what I mean by this is something that I think is very basic. And let's just start at the beginning, okay? God made the first man and the first woman. He told them in Genesis 1, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Now, we talked about this in the first few episodes. If you're engaging the text the way the text wants us to engage it, we are instantly faced with a problem. And that is this: what makes the Garden of Eden so special is that the presence of God is there, dwelling perfectly with the man and the woman. But if he tells them to be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, is he asking them to leave the garden in order to do so? Is he asking them to leave the Garden of Eden in order to fill the earth? In other words, will they have to leave the garden? And even more troubling, will they have to leave God's presence, which is in the garden, and what it is that makes that garden space so special? Now, those are great questions. I hope you ask questions like that. Of course, the answer is no. The man and the wife, him and the woman, will not have to leave the presence of God in order to fill the earth. Rather, the way Genesis 1 and 2 are set up, especially with man's call to work the ground and to keep it, their call is to work the garden and to keep it, is a commission rather to expand the garden to the four corners of the earth, to cultivate the garden in such a way that it grows, that it expands, and that it fills the whole earth. They're given two verbs to describe their role in this garden. And we looked at these in several episodes. I think it was episode maybe 10, 11, and 12. But work it and keep it was one of those episodes. And then we talked about the fact that those two verbs, work and keep, are used throughout the Old Testament when referring to the work of a priest in the temple. And so there are some interesting corollaries here between gardens and temples. Kings, later on in the biblical story, would often have gardens next to their palaces where they would cultivate their garden spaces and cause them to grow, and in a sense would demonstrate to their kingdom that they had the capability of ruling and reigning over this particular plot of land. And so these verbs, work and keep, they are to keep what it is about the garden that makes it special and therefore worth spreading. And they are to work the ground so that it can spread. So they are to expand their perfect place with God so that it is no longer limited simply to this garden, but rather expands and fills the whole earth. Now, as a side note, and we looked at this again in one of these earlier episodes, the rather strange section in Genesis 2 about there being 4 rivers flowing out of Eden suggests that the water source necessary to expand the garden is already in place. There is nothing preventing the man and woman from extending the garden to the 4 corners of the earth. And that's just the point. The entire earth is to become the garden. Now, as another side note, in the final chapters of the book of Revelation, the holy city, New Jerusalem, does in fact fill the entire earth, and it is described as both a city and a garden. The similarities between Genesis 1 and 2 and Revelation 21 and 22 are uncanny, and I would encourage you to go read it for yourself and find out. Final redemption is always aimed at restoring God's original intention for his creation. The man and woman are to expand the garden to fill the entire earth, covering the entire earth with the special place where God dwells in perfect shalom with his people. But here's the million-dollar question, particularly as we get to Genesis chapter 3. Do the man and woman pull this off? Do they spread this garden across the face of the earth? No, they do not. And the reason is simple. Their desire for wisdom apart from God corrupted what made that garden space with God worth spreading in the first place. And they broke their covenant with God and needed to be removed from the garden. In other words, they were exiled from this special garden. They were removed from God's presence and were no longer a blessing to the world. Now, take this idea and apply it to the nation of Israel in the land. The reason why I think it's a valid thing to apply this idea to Israel in the land is because the way the Bible tells its story, what happens in Genesis 1 through 11 deals with universal issues. They deal with the creation of the heaven and the earth. They deal with the creation of the first male and the first female. They deal with sin as it enters the world. They deal with the fall. They deal with the nations as they spread across the world and where cities come from and where kingdoms come from. They deal with death entering the world and the consequences of that death. They deal with a universal flood where a very few select people are saved in the midst of a global catastrophe. And they then deal in Genesis chapter 11 with all of the nations rallying around together in defiance of God's command to fill the earth and subdue it. And they decide to make a name for themselves and remain isolated in Babel, which the biblical story will later pick up on is Babylon, this place of rebellion against God who wants to make itself great over against the commands of the Lord and draw attention to its own greatness as a reason to boast and be proud of itself. In Genesis 12, which is the very first section of the Lord calling a man by the name of Abram, we know, and we've looked at this as well on the podcast, we know that God's call of Abraham and what he promises to do with and through Abraham is in direct contrast to the global corruption that has covered the face of the earth as a result of the fall, as a result of the curse. In fact, in Genesis 12, 1-3, the word bless or blessed is used 5 times. And in Genesis 3 through 11, the word curse is used exactly 5 times. What God is doing in calling one man from the land of Ur of the Chaldeans and promising him a great family, promising him a land, and promising that through him all the nations of the earth would be blessed, God is singling out one man to become one family, to become one nation, so that he can remedy the entire problem of a broken and corrupted world. And so let me read for you Genesis 12, 1-3. It's a passage we will refer to numerous times because as it relates specifically to the promises made to Israel, and some holding this to mean the nation state of Israel today, Genesis 12 will be quoted often. And here's what it says. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation. And I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Now, as I said, in Genesis 11, at the Tower of Babel, those nations gathering together said, let us make a name for ourselves and make this tower with its top in the heavens so that everyone notices our greatness. Here in Genesis 12, not only is God's call of Abram in response to this national rebellion of the peoples at Babel, but instead of the peoples deciding to make their own names great by drawing attention to themselves, the Lord promises that he will make Abraham's name great. And so the way the Bible is telling its story is that the call of Abraham and the subsequent establishment of the nation of Israel is in direct contrast to the brokenness and the fallenness of all that has come before in Genesis 1 through 11 that needs to be restored. And so there's something about the call of Abraham, there's something about the formation of the people that will come from his descendants, which are to become God's means of blessing all the nations of the world. And so automatically, when we get to this understanding of Israel, we know their formation, their very existence is for the purpose of trying to do better than what Adam and Eve once did. And so when you picture it like that, you realize there were God's people, the first man and the first woman, in God's place, a garden. Under God's rule, you may eat from every tree in the garden, only you may not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? And they were enjoying God's blessing. You may have everything you need. Everything you could have wanted is provided for you. You just need to obey me. And if you do, you will experience flourishing. You will experience shalom. In episode 24 on the podcast, How It All Fits Together, I use that idea of the kingdom being defined as God's people in God's place, under God's rule, enjoying God's blessing as a very helpful, overarching way of understanding the biblical story from Genesis 1 all the way to Revelation 22. But when the nation of Israel is formed, when God gives them the special land that they then call Israel, it is for the purpose of establishing this understanding. And so we can't jump into the understanding of the land and forget that in the garden, there also was a special place of land. But the people, Adam and Eve, the first man and the first woman, did not obey God's rule and therefore did not experience his blessing and had to be removed from his place. And so let's take this idea, this expansion that the Garden of Eden is to the land, what the land is to the world, and let's step into for just a second, taking this idea of the land, the way we just took it from the garden, and thinking about some implications here. We have the exact same process all over again, only now it's with a lot more people and a lot bigger space. You have a little garden. I don't know if you picture that as being like the size of your church sanctuary, or if you picture that as being like a back field with several acres. Like, I'm not sure how big you imagine the Garden of Eden to be, but it probably isn't in most of your minds anywhere near the size of Israel-Palestine, at least the land as we know of it on a map today. Unless you happen to visit, then you have even a richer picture in mind of what that is like. God calls a people, Israel, gives them a special place, the land, a place where his presence would dwell with them, and they would learn how to live in communion with God, with one another, and with the creation itself. He gives them this through the law. He explains to them the way justice and righteousness will work in this special place, in this land. But they would have to listen to his voice and not the voice of another. They would need to keep what it was about this special land that made it something the nations around them would come inquiring about. And they would need to cultivate this special place and learn how to fully embody their calling as human beings so that, as the promise to Abraham so clearly states in Genesis 12, all the nations of the earth would be blessed through them. Question: does Israel pull this off? Do they showcase the greatness of their God by their faithfulness in the land so that the nations of the world come inquiring about their God and end up following him too? No, they do not. Their failure mirrored the first man and woman's failure. Their pursuit of wisdom apart from God, expressed most clearly through their repeated idolatry and injustice. They broke their covenant with God, and as a result, God removed them from the land. In other words, they were exiled from their special land. They were removed from God's presence and were no longer a blessing to the world. Are you picking up on the pattern? Can you hear the pattern? I used the same phrases in this section before when talking about the Garden of Eden. They broke their covenant with God. They needed to be removed from the garden. In other words, they were exiled from this special garden. They were removed from God's presence and were no longer a blessing to the world. Here's Israel. They broke their covenant with God, and as a result, God removed them from the land. Not the garden, the land. In other words, they were exiled from their special land. They were removed from God's presence and were no longer a blessing to the world. Do you pick up on the pattern? What starts as a small garden in Eden with two human beings becomes a great nation in the land of Israel. But with the coming of Jesus, the long-awaited Messiah and King of Israel, I want you to think of some of the things that Jesus said and many of the things that Jesus did, and notice that his authority is never limited to the borders of Israel. No, Jesus explicitly tells his disciples in Matthew 28, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. In other words, in Jesus, the special place where God dwells with his people is the whole earth. garden, land, earth. It's a trajectory. It's an ever-increasing in size, growing pattern. Garden, land, earth. Each step along the biblical storyline we go, the bigger the space becomes. The bigger area over which God's king, God's image bearer and ruling image bearer, i.e. his king, has domain. This is why when Jesus says things like, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth," it would be helpful for you to know that in Psalm 37 was one of the richest psalms in the Old Testament, talking about the blessings of being in the land, of being able to inherit the land, of being recipients and receivers of God's promises to his people in the land. Let me just read for you several verses from Psalm 37. "Fret not yourself because of evildoers. Be not envious of wrongdoers, for they will soon fade like the grass and wither like the green herb. Trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land and befriend faithfulness. Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. Fret not yourself over the one who prospers in his way, over the man who carries out evil desires. Refrain from anger and forsake wrath. Fret not yourself, it tends only to evil. For the evildoers shall be cut off, but those who wait for the Lord shall inherit the land. In a little while the wicked will be no more, though you look carefully at his place, he will not be there. But the meek shall inherit the land and delight themselves in abundant peace." Throughout the entire psalm, and I only read for you a handful of verses, throughout the entire psalm, the words "the land" is referenced 6 times through this psalm. And I don't know if you caught it there, but the very last verse I read, which happens to be verse 11, "the meek shall inherit the land," is a straight up quote that Jesus is quoting from in Matthew 5:5 when he's giving us the Beatitudes in his famous Sermon on the Mount. Except I want you to listen to the way this is translated. This is translated in both senses in the New Testament. But blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. You see, when Jesus comes proclaiming his kingdom, understand this to be his universal kingdom, he's no longer interested in just a small plot of land of Israel-Palestine. He's interested in something much larger. Let's look at one more passage in Romans chapter 4. Paul is talking about Abraham, and that's a good thing to talk about, especially as we're dealing with Genesis chapter 12, the passage we read a moment ago. But here's what Paul says: "For the promise to Abraham and his offspring that he would be heir of the world did not come through the law, but through the righteousness of faith." Now, I think we would need to take a step back, and many times we read this passage in Romans 4:13 and think nothing of it. But notice what Paul says. Paul says that the promise to Abraham and his offspring that he would be heir of the world is not something that Paul necessarily got from quoting Genesis 12. Because the quote-unquote promise to Abraham was that he would inherit the land. That was what the promise was, and yet Paul knows now, because of Christ and the offspring of Abraham, which ultimately is pointing to Christ, the heir is one who will inherit the entire world, not one who will merely inherit the land. And this is why I wanted us to start in Genesis, because we need to start with something small in order to know that the purpose in the garden was to expand the presence of God with his people in the garden to encapsulate a larger portion of the earth. In the land of Israel, God gives the people a larger portion of the earth, but the point is the same. They are to cultivate it. They are to keep it. They are to keep covenant with God. You can think of the law that the Lord gives for justice and righteousness for his people in the land. You can think of that very similarly to the way he gave the prohibition to Adam and Eve in the garden. You may eat from every tree of the garden, but you may not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This is your covenant agreement with me. You obey me here, and you get to remain in the garden. You get to expand the garden. You get to cultivate it and cause it to flourish and grow it. And I'll be with you and you'll be with me and everything will be working in perfect harmony. If you step outside of this, you will be exiled from this place. You will be removed from this special place where I dwell. This is exactly the way the Bible tells the story of national Israel. Israel as a people were unfaithful to the covenant, and the idolatry and the injustice that 2 Kings 17 just gives us a litany, a list so long it's exhausting of all the ways that Israel forsook the covenant with the Lord. He exiled them to Babylon. He removed them from the land. And the way the prophets wrote and the way the psalmists wrote to be exiled from the land was identical with death. It was to be dead. It was to be removed from the presence of the blessings of God, who is life. And in fact, what does the Lord say to the first man and the first woman? If you eat from this tree, in the day that you eat of it, you will surely die. Death is a removal from the presence of God. Exile is nothing shy of death. And so when the Lord makes his promises to to Abraham, he is always pointing him to something bigger, right? Abraham's just one man. He's not even, he doesn't even have any sons yet. He's not even about to become a great nation, but he knows that the Lord is promising that this is the direction that he is headed. But what I want to do for just a second is I want us to look at this promise and what it actually tells us about the direction that things are headed. And I'm going to use Munther Isaac's book again. I quoted from him rather extensively the last time that I did a podcast episode because he has so many wonderful things to say. And so I do want to point this out, and some of his questions, some of his insights, I think are phenomenal. So let me just read for you several quotes here from Munther Isaac and what he has to say. You can find him online. He's on Instagram and regularly posts sermons or links to his sermons. He is challenging many of the political ramifications of this current war in Israel-Palestine. As I've said before, he is a Palestinian Christian pastor in Bethlehem. And so I tend to trust many of the insights he's giving because he has lived his entire life dealing with questions and objections to the kinds of things that I'm presenting to you here, because I tend to agree with just about everything he says as far as how he's approaching this topic. But he says, the promise given to Abraham in Genesis 15 is most striking. And this is a passage I didn't read for you, but I will just quote the part that he refers to. It says, on that day, the Lord God made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. Now, that's Genesis 15:18, and he has taken Abraham and pointed to him this great vast land. He wants to promise all of this blessing that will fall upon his people. Now, Munther here is going to challenge for just a second this simplistic idea that the borders of the nation of Israel are something that can be very easily quantified. And here's what he says. He says, this is a huge territory that goes far beyond historical Palestine. And if Christian supporters of Israel are to be consistent in their use of the Bible to support Israel's claim on the land, then must not they also call for Israel to occupy Jordan, Iraq, Syria, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, according to this method of interpreting the Bible? At least they should be consistent. Now, the reason why he says this is because the statement made by God to Abraham in Genesis 15 is from the river of Egypt, the Nile, to the great river, the river Euphrates, is a plot of land far bigger than where they eventually settle. Now, again, if the idea is that you start with a small plot of land and it grows to the land, but then ultimately that is to expand to the earth, then even when God makes promises to Abraham of a coming land, it is never going to be limited to just that spot. So Munther goes on, What we have in this description given in Genesis 15 is essentially a promise of the ancient world as Abraham knew it. These are universal boundaries. And I think he is exactly right. Palestinian theologian Yohanna Cadanacho, and I'm not sure if I pronounced his name right, but I will hope he forgives me if he ever listens to this. He argues from the famous words in Genesis 12, 1-3, that the climax of the speech comes in the statement that in you, Abraham, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. As such, quote, it seems that the land of Abraham is not going to have fixed borders. It will continue to expand, thus increasing in size both territorially and demographically. The land of Abraham will continue to extend until it is equal to the whole earth. End quote. Now this, I think, is very, very important. Even the way the Old Testament speaks of the land as far back as Genesis, which it's just an imaginary idea to Abram when these promises are made. The Lord is already putting in place that the point of this is going to be something that far exceeds this small plot of land. And so Munther goes on and he says, we can point to the many messianic prophecies that speak about what we can describe as the messianic land. For example, in Psalm 2:8, it declares that God will give the king the nations as his inheritance and the ends of the earth as his possession. Micah chapter 5 says that the ruler of Bethlehem shall be great to the ends of the earth. And Zechariah chapter 9 speaks of the coming king, that his rule shall be from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. Now, when we quote passages like Micah 5 or Psalm chapter 2 or Zechariah chapter 9, believe it or not, these are all passages that show up in our Christmas narratives, right? From Bethlehem, a ruler will be born from the city of David, right? That's the Micah, the passage that speaks about the ruler shall be great to the ends of the earth. No time in David's life did he ever reign to the ends of the earth. David was the king over Israel. He wasn't the king over Assyria, which was to the northeast. He wasn't the king over Babylon. He wasn't the king of Egypt, but somehow a king coming from Bethlehem will be great to the ends of the earth. Or in Zechariah chapter 9, which is oftentimes quoted during Jesus' final week of life on earth, during his Passion Week, speaking about how he is going to ride into Jerusalem on a donkey, we're told that his rule shall be from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. In other words, the theology of the land, and I'm not sure if you've ever thought about it like this, but you need to, because this is the way the Bible talks about it. The theology of the land has a universal thrust. We cannot simply speak about the theology of the land, but instead must speak about the theology of the earth. I want you to think for just a second, even when Jesus comes, Israel, think about this, is in the land. And yet, in a very real sense, they are still in exile. Their covenant bond with God drastically needs a makeover. So they may be in the land, like they're physically there, right? But they're still a long way from the Lord. And so what does Jesus do? He doesn't call for a restoration to the land. Israel's already in the land, right? No, but he calls for a restoration to himself, to Yahweh in the flesh, the true temple, the fountain of living water, the true high priest, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world, the true vine, the good shepherd, the bread of life, the way, the truth, the life, and the resurrection. Jesus calls Israel and all the nations to himself. And in so doing, he fills in all that Israel was called to be and restores both Israel and the world to God. He calls Israel to himself. He does not call them to the land. In fact, this explains why the New Testament is virtually silent on any conversation about the significance and importance of the land. We'll look at this in subsequent episodes. I want to take you through several passages, places and significant locations in Israel that meant a lot to the people of Israel, and watch how Jesus just disregards their concerns almost entirely. Right? Jesus shows up in the temple, the one place where everybody thought, the presence of God is here. This is the most significant place ever. And they're talking about how beautiful the buildings are and how wonderful the stones are and how magnificent these great, beautiful places are. And Jesus looks at them and says, not a single stone is going to be left upon another, but the whole thing is going to be thrown down to the ground. Like, what? What kind of a coming king does not elevate the significance of the temple the way every other Old Testament king once did? And Jesus is like, because I'm the temple. These great buildings that you're concerned with, this was never the point. These were all pointers pointing to something greater. And I'd like to suggest to you and submit to you that the same thing applies to the land. You remember when Jesus meets with the woman at the well in Samaria? They're meeting at Jacob's well, and they're having a discussion about which one of them has a right to worship the Lord or which one of them does worship correctly. And the woman poses to Jesus that, the Samaritans worship on this mountain, but you Jews say that the real place to worship is in Jerusalem. So Jesus, what do you think about this? Right? And here's Jesus giving a golden opportunity to say, yeah, there's a significant plot of land that has more significance than another plot of land. And we have a disagreement among people groups regarding which plot of land is more significant. You know what Jesus says? You're both wrong. A day is coming and is now here, Jesus says, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. You are obsessed over which mountain is the correct place to worship, and I am telling you, woman, I'm the place where true worship happens. It is not this mountain or that mountain, or this plot of land, or that plot of land. It is located in me, the king of a coming universal kingdom. And now the reason why this gets so much attention and unfortunately some negative press in my mind is because the prophets really do use phrases like the temple will be rebuilt, and they use phrases like the nations will come pouring into Israel, and the nations will come from the east and the north and the south, and they will locate in Jerusalem. And it really does sound as if everything is going to be centralized once again in this special promised land. And you can take the promises of the Lord in that way. I don't. And the reason I don't is for a simple reason, right? It is simply that the prophets in their time are using old models and old understandings of reality in order to communicate something new that is coming. Only if you communicate something new that is coming that's so different from what everybody understands, it makes zero sense to anyone. And it isn't actually even a word of hope or comfort, because what you're promising is something so outlandish and so far out of what people actually understand that it's meaningless to them. And Christopher Wright is really helpful at just this point, because he says, when the prophets spoke about the future, they could only do so meaningfully by using terms and realities that existed in their past or present experience. The realities associated with being Israel in their day included their specific history and such things as the land, the law, Jerusalem, the temple, sacrifices, and priesthood. To speak of restoration without recourse to such concrete features of being Israel would have been meaningless, even if it had been possible. And I totally agree with him. I think he's exactly right. And so when people quote the Old Testament and say, look, it says everybody's going to be streaming into Jerusalem, this was the people's center of reality. It was all that they knew, right? Notice how the Garden of Eden doesn't really get mentioned much anymore as the biblical storyline goes on because it's been forgotten. It's been left behind and expanded into something much bigger. It's the same reason the New Testament doesn't talk about the land of Israel anymore because it's been forgotten. It's been left behind. We've grown and expanded into something much bigger. And so the prophets will use old models. They'll use old imagery and old terminology in order to communicate the new reality. They use it for this new reality, though described in old terminologies, because it's going to far exceed the original reality. So many of the themes of the new Israel are found in the new Jerusalem, but they are now idealized and even universalized. Now, let me give you a real simple example of this, okay? There was a point in time in the 1700s when horses were a great means of production and power. And somebody along the way, I can't quite remember who this was, but I did in fact look this up several weeks ago and made a couple notes by it. But the term horsepower, okay, one mechanical horsepower. So as this relates to, engines and strength and machinery and things of that sort, 1 horsepower lifts 550 pounds by 1 foot in 1 second. So this is a term to describe power. It's a term to describe, machinery of some kind, mechanical uses, this sort of idea. Think about today. We have muscle cars or Mustangs or convertibles or Dodge Chargers or way better, fancier cars than that. I'm not really much of a car guy myself, so I'm just rattling off a few of the lame ones that I know of. But if somebody says, hey man, what's under the hood? And somebody else looks over and is like 350 horsepower, bro. Like this car this really moves. Today, we still use the term horsepower, even though we haven't used horses for these mechanical uses for decades, sometimes actually entire generations. Like the automobile has been in circulation for over 100 years, and here we are still using the term horsepower to describe it. But what are we saying? Well, we're saying this mechanical horsepower of lifting 550 pounds by 1 foot in 1 second is a reference to the amount of power that something has. So if an Old Testament, well, not an Old Testament, let's say a 16th century prophecy, hey, in the future, they're going to have machines that can operate under 70 horses, right? And it's kind of a silly example, but like, could you imagine 70 horses lined up, 35 pairs of 2 lined up, tail to nose to tail to nose, pulling a cart behind them or something and say, look, 70 horses, this is raw power. Like we could pull, 3 houses behind this horse, 70 horses because it's so strong. And somebody wanted to embellish the idea that in the future, such great power was going to exist at the fingertips of man and they could do incredible things. And somebody was like, you think 70 is great? Well, when the Lord comes, he's going to do 70 times 7. And that's going to be, 490 horsepower. And it's going to be this incredible amount. Well, we have that on the road today. But imagine if somebody had said 300 years ago, they're going to have a Dodge Charger and it's going to drive so fast. Everybody would look around and say, what are you talking about? What's drive? What's Dodge? What's a Charger? What's a road? Like, what's a wheel? Like what's a rubber wheel with an engine under the hood? Like what's a hood? You have no context for it. But even the way we talk today about power, we still use language that's reminiscent of something of the old. And I think the Old Testament functions like that. They'll use images that help their people get into context of what's happening, but the way that actually materializes is something often far different than what you would have imagined, but it's still consistent with the prophecy itself. And this is why it's so important when we think about the Old Testament and how it prophesies realities. The New Testament answers how those prophecies came to fulfillment. We need to allow the way the New Testament interprets those prophecies to enable us to continue to do the same thing with the rest of the Bible. And this is why this inclusive nature and this universal nature of the land of Israel is so important. It's so important right now because what you have is you have Israelites, you have Jewish people claiming they have more of a right to the land than Palestinians. And we get into this ethnic debate now. We're getting into DNA. We're getting into bloodlines. We're getting into history. And all of a sudden, you start looking at this and saying, because of your DNA, you have more of a right to this space than me? And this is why it's important to read the Old Testament knowing Eden, garden, land, earth, right? It's a trajectory, ever increasing, ever growing, ever expanding. And so here's Munther Isaac once again. The theology of the land has always had a universal dimension, pointing toward expansion of the land and inclusion of new families into the family of Israel. Psalm 87 speaks of a day when Jerusalem, the city of God, will be a multinational city that includes people from Rahab, Babylon, Philistia, Tyre, and Cush. He goes on, yet probably the most striking statement that speaks of the inclusive nature of Israel in the coming age is the one spoken by the prophet Ezekiel. Here's Ezekiel 47, 21 and 22. So you shall divide this land among you according to the tribes of Israel. You shall allot it as an inheritance for yourselves and for the sojourners who reside among you and have had children among you. They shall be to you as native-born children of Israel. With you they shall be allotted an inheritance among the tribes of Israel. You see, biblical Israel here is commanded to share the land and consider non-Israelites as native-born. It literally cannot get any more inclusive than that. Isaiah claims that one day the temple will be a house of prayer for all peoples. You see, in the new temple, which Jesus comes to establish, everyone will be equal. The prophet Isaiah asserts that foreigners who have joined themselves to God shall not be cut off. Isaiah speaks on behalf of God, proclaiming, these foreigners I will bring to my holy mountain. Their sacrifices will be accepted on my altar, for my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples. Notice, if you will, that last phrase, my house shall be a house of prayer for all peoples, is what Jesus himself quotes to the religious leaders when he clears the tables of the money changers in the temple. Their idea of the temple was that it was a unique space and a unique place for the Jews only. And Jesus, in ripping their tables down and driving out their animals, was showing them that, in fact, everything they believed about their temple and what made it special was the exact opposite of what the Lord wanted for it. He wanted it to be a place of prayer for all peoples. He wanted Israel to be a place that would highlight the goodness and greatness of their God for the nations around them, not exclude the nations around them because they felt more privileged than the nations. That's not at all how this works. And so it's important when Jesus quotes from the Old Testament to go back to those Old Testament passages to see how did he interpret those passages and what ways are we misinterpreting them. Munther responds and says a lot of times that Palestinian Christians are troubled by the fact that many Christians read the promises of the land given to Israel as if Jesus never came. But Jesus did come. Jesus came and was here to show us exactly what it means to be part of a universal kingdom, an inclusive kingdom for people from all nations, tribes, languages, and tongues, and to be a place of welcoming embrace for all of the creation. So Paul will pick up on in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, it says, for in him, in Jesus, every one of God's promises is a yes. And Munther says this is a loaded statement, and we have every right to include the land as part of these promises. In other words, the story of Israel in its totality, including the part related to the land, must find its fulfillment, its yes, in Jesus. The domain of his kingdom, the domain of Jesus' kingdom, or the domain of the land in Jesus' kingdom, is the whole earth. And this is why every time that the land of Israel is highlighted or emphasized today as being of the utmost importance, it's a regression in God's unfolding plan of redemption. You see, the land of Israel was never the goal. It was a stepping stone to the spread of God's kingdom over the whole earth. And so to refocus God's kingdom on the tiny plot of land in Israel-Palestine is to go backwards. It's to regress to something far less significant than what Jesus established, which is a reign over the entire earth. So in Matthew 28, we can say that Jesus receives all the lands of the earth as his inheritance. And so the promised land has been eclipsed by the breakthrough of what we may call the promised earth. The land has been universalized, as anticipated in the Hebrew scriptures. The kingdom of Israel is now a universal kingdom. It's not limited to one land or one people, because the king in this kingdom has authority over heaven and earth. Jesus redefined and universalized the land. He also redefined and universalized the people of God. For Jesus, being a son of Abraham is not a DNA thing, and it's not about ethnicity. It is about doing the works of Abraham, as Jesus made so clear in John chapter 8. So the Garden of Eden is to the land what the land is to the whole earth. And at the end of all things, the whole earth is also the giant city. It's just the known world at the time, which is why when people are referred to as those who are not welcome to be part of the city, where are they? They are outside the city. They are somehow exiled or removed from this special place that God has set up for his people. What is that special place? It is the entire new earth. It's not a new garden. I mean, it is a garden, right? But it's an earth garden that's the size of a city. And it's called the Holy City, the New Jerusalem, which is prepared, as a bride adorned for her husband. Like, it's this beautiful mixing of metaphors that encapsulates the entire world, people from every tribe and language and people and nation. If you can wrap your mind around this, you can get 90% of what the Bible is trying to communicate. But today, in our political, crazy, partisan upheaval, we've completely missed this. We imagine as if Jesus never came, right? We think that the purpose of the Old Testament is to elevate Israel, not Jesus. We think the purpose of the Old Testament is to point to the land, not Jesus. And all of a sudden, we find ourselves in our attempts to be biblical and faithful to the Bible, disregard the very way Jesus himself interpreted the Bible. And I'm going to go so far as to say that that is exactly what's happened. We have people who have taken their own hermeneutic, which is just their version of interpreting the Bible, and they have decided what the ground rules are going to be for how to do that well. And what they failed to see is how Jesus himself and how Paul himself read the Old Testament and applied its fulfillments in Jesus in ways that literally reshape the way we think about reality. If you ignore that and pretend that these promises that God made in the Old Testament are still waiting to be fulfilled one day, we forget that in Jesus, all of the promises of God are yes. Jesus has answered them. figuring out how that works, that's a good challenge and a good thing to put your energy toward. But imagining that Jesus hasn't addressed those things and that the central point of all of history is hovering and centering around the land of Israel-Palestine, where people can, in the name of God, go in and wipe out entire people groups because they themselves have suffered and have been, hurt by other countries. I get it. I get the tension. It's crazy, but it is not helpful when Christians try to weigh in on this and imagine that God is up in heaven, just very pleased with all of the people who are gathering around Israel and unquestioningly supporting everything that they say and do. We need to read the Bible as Christians. We need to read the Bible as Jesus followers. And that doesn't just apply to the character we exhibit when we read it. It also applies to the theology of the land, the theology of the earth, understanding how and in what ways Jesus redefined the land. Jesus redefined the temple. Jesus redefined the kingdom, and how he universalized promises that for hundreds of years were centrally located in the land of Israel. It does not mean that the land is not special or important. It means it's a regression to imagine that God's continuing work of redemption in salvation history today is centered at all upon a tiny plot of geographical space. That is simply not the way the Bible tells the story. And to assume that it does is to miss huge implications for what Jesus has come to do and what has in fact already done. I want to show you some of those specifics next time on the podcast, and I hope that you're ready to tune in with me. Please send me questions, send me comments, send me insights, whatever you have going on. Maybe your head is spinning. Maybe you threw your phone across the room because you can't believe I'm saying some of these things. Maybe your mouth is hitting the floor because you've never heard anybody talk like this. Maybe you agree with all of this and you're like, wow, why hasn't, he said this before? This is so simple. I don't know what your response is, but whatever it is, I'd love to hear it. Send me an email, find me online. Let's interact. Let's engage. Let's have a good time with this. And we're going to continue to grow as we try to be faithful to the Bible, but even more importantly, faithful to Jesus and the way Jesus interprets the Bible and how he leads us to be citizens of a universal kingdom, focused not on a small plot of land, but focused on the entire world. So that's all the time we have for the podcast this week. Thank you so much for tuning in. I love the interaction I get from you all. I love the feedback I get. And I'm looking forward to continuing this discussion through this mini series. I hope you have a fantastic week, and I will talk to you next time.